Hello everybody and welcome to a bonus episode on the What is Tabletop channel, where we're going to be doing a review of the Antagonist RPG by James Sommerton. Full disclosure, we were given free copies of the RPG to review by James himself, but that will not stop us from saying what we really feel about this RPG. Charles, myself, and one of our other players had the chance to sit down and play this RPG. I took both of those players through this campaign guide, where we spent about a session or two making characters and going through the setting. So if you're new to What is Tabletop, when we review RPGs, we have three categories that we like to break it down into. Complexity of the game, how well the theme fits with the mechanics, and the format of the book. We tend to do this on a scale where there's two different extremes for each category. Our goal is not to tell you whether or not to play the RPG. Our goal is to just simply give you the information so you can make that decision yourself. With all that being said, let's get to the review. So the setting of Antagonist is not your stereotypical fantasy setting. I mean, it kind of is, but not from the viewpoint that we're used to. A lot of these are used to Lord of the Rings, where you're the Fellowship making your way to stop the evil Dark Lord. But this begs the question, if society is running with a Dark Lord, who are the people working for the Dark Lord? That's where Antagonist comes in. You play as the minions to the Dark Lord who's about to be defeated. Your characters are trying to manipulate society for their benefit, socially, economically, and of course, politically, all the while being unaware of the empire about to crumble out right from beneath you. So you play the bad guys. You're doing bad guy things. You're manipulating people. You're trying to gain a leg over them socially. Perhaps you're trying to cripple them economically, or you're sending in a military might to strong arm your opponent. Regardless of how you wish to do it, this game gives you various different ways in order to accomplish that goal. Now, what is the main mechanic of this game? This system has a 3d10 dice system. When the game master calls for a roll, they will state up to 3 different skills that the player is going to make. For example, if you're at a social party where you're trying to gain some information out of a political opponent, the GM might ask you to make a roll using intrigue, authority, and lore. You'll then take a d10 representing each of the 3 skills and roll them. The GM decides a difficulty number, with 9 being about moderate difficulty. The players then count the amount of dice that meet or exceed that number. You are given bonuses to add to the dice as well, so you're not just rolling the dice by themselves. In our example roll, I have an intrigue of +2, an authority of +4, and a lore of +0. I roll my dice, add my modifiers, and however many successes I get determine how well I succeed. A 0 is a flat failure. You do not get any bonuses, nothing good happens to you. 1 success is a partial success. You get something good, but also something bad. 2 successes is a full success. You achieve the thing you were out to do. 3 successes is equivalent to a critical hit, meaning not only did you achieve what you wanted to do, but you get something extra on top. This is the whole point of the game. You tell the GM what you want to do, they tell you what skills apply, and you make the according roll. It's quite possible the GM might ask you to double up on multiple skills. For example, if you're climbing a fence, it might be brawn, and finesse, rather than 3 separate unique skills. This means you still roll 3 dice as normal, but your brawn skill is applied to 2 of the dice. The other unique thing about the system is that it has seasonal turns as well as turn-based combat. Seeing that crippling your enemies from an economic standpoint might take a long time, many in-game days to accomplish, this is where the season turn comes in. Season turns and combat turns are treated very much the same. You get 3 actions per round. Some actions require only 1 action in order to accomplish. Others might require 2 or even 3. This is true regardless of if it's a season turn or a combat turn. Once everyone has completed a round, if the GM thinks that the situation has been handled, you end the encounter. However, if the GM believes that there's still more to be done, you continue with another round. There's other mechanics that play into the game, such as advantage, disadvantage, skill checks, and sorcery spells that flesh out the game as a whole. Now let's get into our 3 categories. First one is complexity. How complex is this game? I'm going to be really honest about this game, and James said that we were allowed to go as brutal as we wanted to give good feedback. This game is incredibly complex. There are multiple different ways that you can create a character, ranging from a point-buy system to just generating the stats as you wish. However, there's one version of character creation that is so complex you need a spreadsheet in order to calculate it properly. I hate to tell you, that's too complex. That's going to be difficult for most people to comprehend. I trust that the math is involved to make it fair, that everybody gets the right amount of pluses and minuses depending on what background you take and what kind of character you're playing. But from my standpoint, it's really complicated. I don't want to have to spend so much time searching through all of these different details, wondering what the difference is that I get a +1 to this skill, but not to this skill. And it also gets really confusing because in this advanced system, you will create the tiers that you then put the skill points into to determine what modifier the skill has. And depending on what the number was that you started with determines how many points you can then put into it later. If it sounds confusing, it is. Luckily, this game does include a quick start version, which honestly probably should have been the default character creation. That is predominantly what we used. We were able to make characters really quick and get into gameplay very fast. The nice thing is there's actions for so many things that you're going to be doing in this game. Do you want to economically cripple your opponent? There is a skill for that. It tells you how many actions it takes, how long it takes, what skills you have to roll, and it even includes the outcomes for all the different types of successes. I think that is great. I think that is awesome. The downside is there is a lot of actions. An argument many people like to make about crunchier games is there's not a lot of room to do creative and unique stuff. Or if there is, you really have to know the game before you can do it. This game, half of our time was spent figuring out what actions each of our players could do. Part of me just wanted to pick the skills and let them roll, but there are specific actions involved with specific results. There are some benefits to it, and we'll get to that in the theme section. But having so many possible actions spread over the course of multiple pages on the book, it makes it very difficult to remember what you can and can't do. And all this to say is, unless your character uses magic, your characters feel very similar. Again, we only played this for a few sessions, but it didn't feel like my characters felt different than each other. Sure, they did different actions depending on what the player character did, but it didn't feel like they each had their own uniqueness to them. Ultimately, when it comes to complexity, it feels like this game is hyper complex for so little to do. I love the 3d10 dice mechanic. I think that's a really interesting and cool mechanic, but there's only 9 skills in the game, and 8 if you don't use magic. I almost think this game would work better if it was more like Traveler or Call of Cthulhu, where you had so many skills that you could argue work for a situation. Perhaps you're picking a lock, but there's a bunch of guards who are about to come after you. You can use your lockpicking skill, you can use a vigilance check, and you can use finesse, right? 3 different skills that all fit pretty well. I feel like if this game had more skills, it would just work better. The system would be much more interesting. You can go back and forth with your players about which skill works for where. That does mean you would probably have to get rid of each action in order to make it work, because the actions I get are where you make your choices. But again, by having so few skills, it makes it really hard to differentiate your characters. So on our scale of complexity, we like to rank from playing pretend on a kindergarten playground to I'm basically playing a board game. We would have to say that this is on the extreme end of complexity. It's equivalent to a board game. And in some ways, I almost wish it was a board game. My players found so few times they were actually making choices and rather just doing things that made sense in the moment. I had to be the one to set up the situations, and they were the ones who reacted. It almost feels like if this was a board game where a deck of cards determined what scenario you went into and you chose how you reacted to it, it would play almost the same way. Now let's move on to the theme. Does the theme of the book fit into the mechanics well? In some ways, yes. The nice thing about having so many different types of actions is you can just read the header and say, that is exactly what I want to do. And you're gonna be able to find the means to do it. That's great. That's awesome design. I like having 3 different health bars, basically. One for your physical health, one for your economic status, and one for how the people view how honorable you are. In a game where being outcasted because you aren't showing enough affection and glory to the emperor, being as important as your economic status or your health is really interesting. But again, when it comes to each player and each character, they don't feel that different from each other. In skill-based games, there's 2 ways to go about it. Making one skill incredibly good, so that way you are that good at that skill. Or make it to where you have so many skills that you can be good in a bunch of different ones, but the likelihood of you overlapping with someone is very rare. In this game, there's only 9 skills, so you think they would go with the former, making yourself really good with something. But the fact that you're rolling multiple skills per roll makes it to where it doesn't matter how good you are at one individual skill, because you need to be good with 3 skills in order to succeed at such a good rate. And so to counteract that, you're good at several skills. But again, because there's so few skills, the overlapping is more likely to happen between players. So instead of it being like Blades in the Dark, where you have your party's lockpick and that is their job, or you have the face of the party and his job is to distract people, in Antagonist, it just feels like everybody kind of does the same thing. I will say the seasonal turn thing is phenomenal. I actually really like that mechanic. There's a part of me that wants to just take that mechanic and see if I can make it into a system neutral thing. There's many times in my RPG campaigns where I'm gonna have a long term happening. There's a time skip and the players get to do a bunch of stuff. And it's always awkward because the players aren't entirely sure what they can do. But with a seasonal turn, we can keep the pace going, we can keep it moving without one player hogging all that spotlight, while at the same time giving the players a little bit of options that they can and can't do. Again, I really like that mechanic. Some of these mechanics individually are really good. It's just clumping them in the system together, they don't mesh too well. So how well do the themes and mechanics blend together? On our scale, we go from an abstract game to LARPing. Where does this one land? I would say it lands around the middle. It does a pretty good job, a little bit more on the LARPing side. So around like a 6 or a 7. Again, some of the mechanics and how they work in the game are really cool. I just think how they mesh together, there's some problems. Finally, we go to the book outline. How easy is this thing to read? Remember when I was talking about the spreadsheet when it comes to character creation? It almost feels like that. There's a lot of times where the examples given in the book are for niche scenarios, which is great and very much appreciated. But there's very few times that I was given an example for how a normal role should go. It made it a little complicated, and I had to read between the lines of, this is how a normal role works. Conversely, you also have many different actions that are clumped together based off of certain attributes. And while in some ways that makes it easy to remember where they are, in other ways, very hard to remember exactly where they are in the book, which makes looking them up difficult. And again, the character creation section was super confusing. There were parts of it where it felt like it would tell you how to make characters one way, and then jump to a different way to do it, and then jump back and forth between the two. For example, on page 34 of the book, it tells you, start with a concept, pick your backgrounds, determine your virtues, point by. Then it gives you a simpler version of the point by, optional role. Then it goes back to telling you how to make your character. Then it tells you a point by again, another simple build version. Then it tells you about how to design your things, only to later on tell you, here's an even simpler version of how to use the game. I would have almost liked it better if it said, this is the way you should create your characters, here's the quick start rules, and then here's the complex version. And have each of those be in their own segments rather than constantly flowing in and out between the different rule sets. Ultimately, the point of an RPG book is a reference manual. If I'm confused with how a rule works, I should be able to open my book, find out where I can find that ruling, and read it out loud. But with this book, there were so many different spots it could be in, with very little redundancy, it was hard to know exactly where I needed to go for certain rulings. So when it comes to our outline, we like to give it a scale from a bunch of charts that are incomprehensible to reading a fantasy novel. So I would have to give this one a 3. It is definitely more close to reading charts. While there aren't a lot of charts in this book, the complexity of reading from point to point gets a little confusing. The layout could have used a little bit more work with how certain things were grouped together. And some of the examples could have included just generic examples for how things work rather than the exceptions and only the exceptions. So how do I, Frank, personally feel about this book? It's not for me. I do like complexity, I do like crunch, but this feels like it's too much complexity for how little crunch there actually is. Charles and I poured over this book trying to figure out how it worked, and it took us a long time to figure it out. And then trying to explain it to our friend, he kept asking us questions, we kept trying to figure out the answer, and it continued to be difficult to understand. Now, if you're the kind of person who loves the fact that there is an answer for everything, you might enjoy this book. It's quite possible there's people out there that enjoy it. Again, there are parts of this book that I really like. The 3d10 dice mechanic is a really interesting mechanic. The seasonal turn is great. I love the seasonal turn, but it's the weaving together of a lot of these things that don't fit well for us. So let us know what you think in the comments. Have you played Antagonist before? Is this the first time you're hearing of it? Are you interested in picking it up? Have I gotten any rules wrong? Let us know in the comments. Also, please subscribe so we can keep making more videos. We have plenty of other playtesting material that we can cover and discuss and give videos on, and we would love to do that. If you have an RPG you would like to see us review, let us know, and if enough people want us to, we'll make a video about it. Until the next time we see you, make sure you stay witty.